We want to welcome Lisa Katona Smith to Talking Addiction Recovery podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
Yeah, we're going to talk a lot about your book, Parallel Recovery. You also had a really magnificent TED Talk that I want to get into a little bit too. But before we do, can you just give the audience a little bit of a background about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I was a teacher for 23 years and I have a background in educational philosophy. And over the course of raising my family, my oldest son started struggling with mental health and substance use disorders and really kind of fell into having to learn for myself how to navigate that journey in a more compassionate way than what was really being offered at the time. And so I made a shift in my career path, and now I support families who are also going through that process. And I'm an author and a speaker, and have created a system that I call Parallel Recovery, which is really inviting the family system into the change process to share that burden.
Yeah, so something that really wasn't planned on, right? This was not
Yeah.
something where you dreamed of doing or even anticipated, but something happened to a loved one, impacted you significantly and really changed the course of what you do.
Yeah, yeah, it's absolutely. I had no intention of leaving the job and career that I was in. But over over our journey and having to learn for myself, having to kind of be the teacher for myself, and then being able to have the courage to start speaking our story, I realized that families, it wasn't just us, it was all families were feeling very unsupported and very unguided and untaught. And I think it worked out well that I have a background as an educator and I can really create systems where people can learn in. And so it's always interesting where your life takes you.
And did you think that helped you a lot in where you like your background in education? Because you're right, there are other people who do this. There are other people who work with families, reach out to families and try and work directly with that specific area of who's impacted. But that education background, you because it's hard to reach out to families. It's hard to talk to some people about these issues and topics. But do you feel like that education background was really something that helped you to be able to do that?
Yes, for sure. I didn't realize it was. When you leave education, people always say, "Oh gosh, what's on your resume probably isn't everything that you know how to do," but which is a true statement. Educators are miracle workers, but understanding how do people learn and how do I step to them where they're at today with their knowledge base and their patterns of action and behavior and language and guide them to a better place. I mean, that's really what education is, guiding people to more enlightenment and more understanding through a series of steps while meeting them where they're at. So, for sure, it has definitely benefited me, but I didn't necessarily think it was a connection.
Yeah, that's fascinating. The your TEDx talks was called The Power of Parallel Recovery. We're gonna have a link for audience listeners to watch it and listen to it. Can you talk a little bit about being on that and sharing something as difficult or
Mm-hmm.
challenging and as needed as substance use and really the family perspective or how to work with families, what that was like having that TEDx talk?
Yes, I can. Thanks for asking that question. That's really important. I think, there are a lot of family members who have spoken publicly, whether in political environments for advocacy or grassroots environments for, grassroots change and that kind of stuff. And I really wanted to come at my TED Talk with lived experience as a family member and also really heightened skilled professional experience from my current seat. And one of the things that I think is missing in the space, and probably, this is a unique substance use in particular, is a unique place to offer people help. And there's a lot of people in recovery who are now therapists for people, in treatment and that kind of stuff. And I do think that there's a ton of value. It's really hard to just have a book understanding of somebody's experience and invite them into the very, very difficult change process when you're talking about substance use and even the overarching umbrella of mental health disorders. And so I think that, my TED talk was, a step into bravery about really making my story public, but also I really wanted to offer more than just pity or somebody feeling sorry for a family member. I wanted to offer action steps. I wanted to offer empowerment. I wanted to offer some pokes and invitations for the treatment industry to maybe do things a little differently and hopefully, I think, better. And so I tried to really toe the line and walk on both sides of that line of I can stand in front of another family member and tell them that I understand what it feels like to be guided by fear and how that isn't effective in loving your person better. Because I live in that. I know what that means. And I can speak from a professional standpoint because I work with families specifically, so I can speak to other collegial professionals about what might be missing for the family members and how certain language is not helpful to those family members in inviting them into the change process. And sometimes I sit in meetings of groups of people that I work with and I'll say something like this: can we stop feeling sorry for the moms? Because a lot of people will just feel sorry for the moms. And you know what? I'm a mom and sometimes I need a pity party. But feeling sorry for me without some actionable education and skills and tools behind that acknowledgement and validation of my experience isn't helping the person who's in your care. So not feeling sorry for the moms, but empowering the moms, and it's not just the moms, but all family members, is I think essential. And when I went about my TED Talk, I was really very intentional about wanting to speak to all of those things, not just, oh, this is another mother's story.
Yeah, and that was where there's always a call for more help for families and not enough as well. Like there's always a need for more. We're seeing more things. I've seen, certified family.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen that kind of expand across different states of like certifications and all this type of stuff. So I think there's always been like we need more for this. But there's been a hard time filling the gap. And when I looked at what you did, and also when I read your book, I noticed yours also wasn't some of the traditional ways
Mm-hmm.
of how it would be approached, which also I was curious how that was going to be accepted or not because of how it was approaching the impact of the family and also what the family can do. And one of it was earlier on in your book. It was in page 26. This is one of the things that stood out to me right away was you were talking about how it's natural and understandable reactions to try and force our person to change. But our needs belong to us. They are our burden, our heavy coats to wear. I really loved how you start to describe that because now I'm seeing sort of that coat that
Yeah.
that someone's wearing that then gets placed on to someone else. And it's really hard to talk to families about some of that. Well, what were you doing or how were you responding to this? What was your reaction? Because normally we know the spotlight goes to the substance use, the mental health, the gambling, like that's usually
Mm-hmm.
what. And so when you all already early on in the book described that, I was really connected with that as to how we start having those conversations with family members and those who are impacted.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, how have you gotten some of the reaction when normally they might be looking for the pity party? They might be looking for, oh, if you just do this, then this will change, or no, you got to do that. This was kind of a challenge
Mm-hmm.
for the family members, not necessarily this is what you do to challenge the person that's got the substance use.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Roll your sleeves up because we're doing some hard work. Yeah. And that's why I call it parallel recovery, right? Like we don't get to a recovery process without work. Our person doesn't, and we don't either. We don't just wait for them to get better and then returned to us without doing any work ourselves. How can we show up differently in this relationship? I say it in my TED talk that, I woke up a door slammer and I didn't go to bed one. And we've got to take some hard looks at ourselves about how am I participating in some of the problems, which is a very different message than you caused this problem. Um, I have yet to meet a family member, even really family members with some pretty deep and long-standing unhealthy behaviors. Nobody is trying to suck at this. Nobody is. They really aren't. They just don't have the practice and the modeling and the space to learn how to do this different. And I try to hold space for, where is somebody? I'm not going to tell someone they need to do something, but I might ask very hard questions around, why are you doing it this way? Is there a gain? And if there is a gain, sometimes it's okay. We have needs too. Like we are impacted in this journey, and we do have needs to not feel so scared or to feel some type of relief from worry. We have needs, and those aren't bad, but it's that I'm going to use a word I don't like to use, but everybody understands it when it's utilized. Instead of calling it sort of codependent patterns, I described it like the coat, right? Like I have some needs, and when I place those needs on somebody else to fix, then I've got this entangled emotional, like it's confusing. It's confusing whose job is whom's. And all we can do as family members is create sustainability for us to keep doing this. So, how do I establish some boundaries, really implement self compassion and self care into my livelihood, and then connect to the person? And that's the second piece of my whole kind of process is sustainability of families and connecting to the person. And I think in the past there's been one or other of those two things. Either it's been offered step back, detach with love. We have all heard that phrase. And I understand because every time I kind of go after that phrase a little bit, but it's rarely explained probably properly. And if explained properly, it's not a terrible thing, but I do think that it's interpreted incorrectly. It's step back, take care of yourself. You got to save yourself. This boat's going down. Get your life vest on. And there's some value in that, but there's never then the next step of how do I go back in? How do I go back in and support this other person who doesn't know where their life vest is right now? Or the other model has been it's swung the other way a little bit too far, which is feel sorry for the families and then just give them permission to be in their pity party without actionable steps to make any changes that feel very powerful to them at all.
I'm glad you brought up codependent because it's another area with language because you do talk about language
Yeah.
in your book, and I could see the mindfulness of the language being used. You mentioned the other terms, and also I think a lot like with enabler, and sometimes we use enabler, codependent, and that all of a sudden like creates attachment of this is who I am, which is usually a
Yeah.
lot of like shame based, which I think when you talk about the code, that's more of like what I did,
Yeah.
not necessarily like who I am, that I'm this. And that's really hard with families because I've seen it where a family member does the same exact thing as another family, but because the outcome was different, either they're called a supporter or they're called an enabler.
Mm-hmm.
Not because of what they did necessarily, but because if I bailed my son out, they stopped using. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
look at you, you supported them. I bailed
Mm-hmm.
my son out. He continued to use while you're an enabler. And I feel
Mm-hmm.
like as some of the awareness of substance use increase, so does sometimes our use of words that can
Yeah.
cause harm. And
Yeah.
I've seen that a lot in families with the terms enablers, codependent. And I sometimes struggle with that because hearing that from another family is one of the hardest things for another family to hear, because they're like you said, trying their best. They
Hmm.
don't know what else to do. A lot of this is reactionary because something's happening and it's just in the moment. What do I do? Because in a lot of it, Michael Barnes, another author,
Hmm.
talks about how like a lot of it is like a trauma response.
Hmm.
And to me, I'm like throwing around those words then just to me reinforces shame when it's already hard enough to talk about as a family member. It's already hard to talk about this. And if we can be more mindful of our language. So my question to you is, you make sure language is an important thing that you use too. When it comes to the issues of like codependency,
Hmm.
enabler, they always come up in this space with families and with substance use. How do you maneuver that? Because
Yeah.
I still think we have a lot of work to do on words that have been around in this area for a very long time. There's a lot of resources and things
Yeah,
labeled with
there's
that.
whole
Like,
books on with those words.
yeah, yeah. So how do you, knowing you trying to sort of break through some of this old old way of trying to
Hmm.
address it, how do you tackle some of those things on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to start with enabling first because I think that's the easier word to address. And I really shift the language to is what you're doing or about to do right now, empowering them to want to do better or to do better? Are you empowering them? And if you're not, then the other E word might be coming up into play, right? Like if you're keeping them in a position to not have to make a hard decision or, a right turn or a left turn or, any type of change or even be able to look in the mirror, then how can we shift your behavior to be more empowering to them? And sometimes it's really not even about the end result of the behavior looking different, but the way you communicate what you're about to do being different. And I'm trying to think of an example, but there are people who are, I don't know if I want to use the word fine, but find peace or acceptance with allowing somebody in active addiction to live in their home. There are people, and that works for them, at least for the moment, right? So an enabling conversation around that would be, well, I can't, a good mother wouldn't put their child out. Okay. Um, an empowering language might be, I am aware that there is destructive behavior going on in my home. And right now I am working on connecting to my person daily so that we can have conversations around what it might look like to change. And for today, it is working for us for him to live in our home. That's a very different, I mean, he's living in the home, but the intentionality underneath it. So I really challenge families. And I think as a general rule in our society, we like to stay pretty surface. We don't like to go super deep because that's kind of hard. But I really challenge people to go underneath just the topsoil. Like, what's going on underneath here? Maybe you've got two parents and one of them's not on board with following through. Well, it's hard to set a boundary when someone's not going to follow through. It's actually ineffective and maybe more harmful. So, going back to enabling, can you ask yourself the question, is what I'm about to say or do empowering them to make a better or different choice? And if the answer is no, then how can you do that instead? In terms of the language of, um, by the way, I in my inbox just this week, I received a newsletter from somewhere, and there was a workshop being given to families, and it was entitled "This: Stop Enabling Now." And I have a support group that I host on Wednesdays. And we talked about that. I brought it up and I said, I just really feel like that's not a super big invitation to me because immediately there's a judgment that I'm doing something wrong, not an understanding that what I'm doing is solving a pain that I have. That's definitely not an invitation. Now, if that same workshop would have been learn how to empower a struggling loved one, I would have said, I'm in. I'm in. I want to learn, but I don't want to be judged.
Yeah. It's like
I mean,
the
it's just,
shock factor of like the language of, like it's gonna grab attention or it's
Totally. And I'm just
and
like, nothing like has the gloves come off, like, but to call a mother an enabler when her child might be dying. Like, that's really, it's not an invitation.
yeah.
So,
And who wants to show up to a place being like, oh, I'm here for the enabler group or
right.
but if I'm here for the empowering parents or something, I mean, I think that's where we try to separate. Like we're not trying to say this is who you are and shame you,
Mm-hmm.
but this is what I think one of the best things that a counselor of mine ever asked me was like, challenge yourself to how do I show up today or how do I show up in this situation? That it's not really about the outcome or controlling the outcome
Yeah.
or anything about what the other person's going to do, but when I'm in a certain situation, like how do I want to show up in
Yeah.
that sort of sense? And I think that's would work a lot better with parents and loved ones
Totally.
than the catchy or the labels of codependency and
Yeah.
enabling.
Yes. And in terms of codependency, I reframe it and just call it participation, right? Like sometimes we participate in problem patterns because we don't know how else to participate. And all people need to be given is other options and then support around their experience trying new things. I mean, this, Andrew, like kind of going back to your original, like, is there a connection between being an educator and this is it right here, right? Like understanding how do people learn, what is motivational to get people to learn. I mean, the goal of educators isn't to tell students everything they don't know because they don't know anything. That's why they're in school. So why would we do the same for parents who, by the way, were not given this manual when they left the hospital?
And I love that, just hearing that because I think too often there is an assumption that parents should know or they should have known or that as parents they are the experts of their children and everyone else. So I really appreciate that recognition of that education perspective of people don't know, and that is why we
Yeah.
educate. That is why we teach. So I really appreciate that. That was very insightful. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's kind of how I handle those two words. I mean, it's definitely the behaviors that are labeled those words are concerns and get in the way and create problems. And so what we need to address is those behaviors and how to do those behaviors differently rather than stopping the conversation or the interest in learning, the people's empowerment. People want to do better. Everybody wants to do better in their life. And they just need to be invited into that process.
I wanted to talk to you about one of the chapters you wrote because I'll tell you this is not a topic that I often see covered in family related ones or coming from someone with those experiences. You actually talk about harm reduction versus absorbing harm, which I was very taken back by because, like I said, it's not one that I see very often. When you bring up harm reduction among families, communities, you get usually one spectrum of a response, and then you get usually the other side. So I found it very insightful and to you, kudos and recognition of willing to talk about that with an audience that may already have not the best ideas or awareness or views on harm reduction. Because I was a counselor for 20 years now. I didn't really learn much about it until the last like 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't get any of it in my education. Now I do a lot of talking about it. I do harm reduction psychotherapy, but talking with it with families is definitely a challenge. And you decided to write a whole chapter on it. So how did you decide to make that such an important part of a book? Because I mean, this
Mm-hmm.
is you got to make room for things and figure out what
Yeah.
won't go in it. But you picked an entire chapter on harm reduction versus absorbing harm. Can you talk about that?
Yes. Yes. So this was decided on because my process of supporting families is really about including the families in the treatment team. bringing them up. We got to bring up the family so that they can be a part of this treatment team. It's not about sending your loved one away to other professionals to fix them and then send them back to you, a system where, by the way, they got sick there for various reasons, but they did. They got sick in front of your face. So we've got to be able to, as families, step into part of the role of the treatment team. And if we're going to do that, we need to understand that in today's world, as addiction treatment has developed, more people are living because of a harm reduction approach. And so families also should understand what harm reduction is, being careful that that could also get a little bit entangled with the other E word, right? Enabling. But also the second part of that title, versus absorbing harm. The absorbing harm piece would be kind of that enabled person, right? Like, I'm going to take on somebody else's harm to prevent them from feeling it. It's not about preventing consequences. It's about keeping somebody afloat long enough to say yes to help. That's all
And
it is.
I liked how you wrote about there was a part in it of where we demonize the behavior because I talk about that a lot because we live harm reduction every day. It's
Totally.
and when I do talks about this or I'm at a conference speaking on harm reduction, I usually point out like, hey, we got fire extinguishers there. That doesn't enable us to light fires. How many of
Hmm.
you drove here this morning and used your seatbelt? Well, seatbelts don't enable us to drive recklessly. So when I talk about those things, people can relate to that, but there's
Yeah.
not a lot of stigma attached to fire extinguishers or to
Right.
vehicles or accidents. Even when someone has an accident, they go, well, it was an accident. And, even when someone did something, there's still a lot more compassion. So when you wrote about demonizing, I thought that was really important to understand because to me, you can't maintain demonizing that so long without it now going on to the person who's
Yes.
engaging in that behavior. And that's the
Right.
scary part. You can't sustain that sort of evil and hate that then will transfer onto that person. It
Right.
just I haven't seen someone be able to just fully really separate that. And you really talk about where that becomes like a demonized thing in this
Yeah.
in this talk.
Yeah, for sure. So again, if somebody's not engaged in professional help, who do they have in front of them that could be impactful? The family. So teaching families what is harm reduction. And by the way, in my book, I do not write about, providing safe needle spaces or safe use spaces in your home. There's people who may feel comfortable with that. I would not personally. However, how many times have we heard, let me know when you're a year sober? So, like, we can't connect to this person until they've got a year sober. What would happen if we could utilize that time to build the connection, which then invites that person who's struggling to want more of what's positive in their life? And if we as family members can understand what harm reduction can do, that it can actually create a path of sustainability, of health for that person, there's so much value. There's a woman that I have worked with for a long time and is now in my support group, whose son had been using fentanyl and for years, really bad, and had gotten to a place where he drank alcohol and used marijuana. And that changed her work, as well as some of his changes, changed their relationship. And she worked over the last quite a while to really connect with her son in that different level of not using. Like, he was able to connect with her differently because he was functioning a little bit better. And ultimately, that path led to him realizing through various consequences that probably alcohol and marijuana also aren't good for him. However, had she completely detached from him 2 years ago when he was using fentanyl, he may not be here today to have
Yeah.
this conversation. In fact, he
Yeah.
likely wouldn't be here today.
I remember that as a clinician a long time ago when I worked at a place where, it was for opioid treatment. And if you were using marijuana, they wouldn't kick you out because the goal was to,
Mm.
to treat the opioid use disorder. And
Oh,
it was
yeah,
outpatient. So,
sure.
and part of that was, I remember this. I had someone who they were using opioids and marijuana, but they had no plan to stop the THC use, but they really wanted to address their opioid use. So, yeah, let's work on that.
Yeah.
Like that's really having an impact on you. And I worked with this person for 2 years. And then all of a sudden they were like, I think I want to cut down on my marijuana use. And we started talking about like what was going on, why was that, what was happening, and part of him was starting to realize that it wasn't, now that he stopped the opioid use, he still realized that marijuana wasn't helping him
Mm.
as much as he thought. He always said it helped with his anxiety, and then he's talking about how, well, I'm not using opioids anymore, but my anxiety is still pretty high. And he actually decided he wanted to quit. And he quit THC use. And he never used THC. But I always say this story that if we would have told him, hey, you gotta stop THC
Hmm.
use right now too, he probably would have never stayed or come back.
Yeah,
He,
yeah.
he
It
probably would
keeps
have
the door
left.
open. It
Yeah.
keeps the door open. And you can create boundaries. And in that chapter, I talk about that, right? Like creating boundaries around behavior that is harmful to you. That is an important part of harm reduction for a family member. And in that chapter, I actually discuss a family that I worked with that the person left treatment and was just like, I don't want to be done using drugs. And the family had done so much work of connecting and repair in this relationship and understanding to not connect the person to the behavior that they were able to actually get a harm reduction specialist and he engaged in that part. He didn't want to die. He wasn't done using it. And it wasn't too long before he said, okay, I'm done. SAMHSA, their working definition of recovery, I'm going to look at my screen for a second and read it directly. I think it's beautiful. A process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness, live a self directed life, and strive to reach their full potential. It says nothing about sobriety. And what that did when SAMHSA created that type of a definition of recovery, it opened the floodgates of people who could engage in a
Yeah.
recovery process, in a harm reduction process. It wasn't all or nothing. And this goes back to how do people learn? They learn by being motivated, by wanting something more than they want something else. And we can't get them there usually. And today it's just frankly, it's too dangerous. People don't get there when we only put a hard line out. And I get it. Like in treatment, you can't have somebody using drugs, kind of, alongside other people who are in treatment. Like there's some hard boundaries in treatment, but this is where again I want to just empower families to become a part of the treatment team because before treatment it might look like having conversations with somebody who is cutting back on or not using IV drugs but pills. Not that
Yeah.
that's good, right? But like it's less harm. How do we keep people afloat so that we can keep inviting them and connecting with them and offering them something that they want to come out for? That's what it is about. So I thought it was a really important chapter. I when I work with families, it's not soft. It's we talk about hard things.
Yeah.
Actually, the very
Have
first
to.
chapter is hard easy or
Yeah.
easy hard.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Your chapter 12, which we talked about language, and one thing I wanted to address with you and bring up is you talk about most of us would admit that we have told lies at different times in our lives, but we'd also firmly reject the label of liar.
Mm,
I just had a post on LinkedIn the other day that people showed a lot of love for when it comes to calling people who use substances liars.
mm.
Yet, everyone lies. I do a talk on lying in general, that it's not just a thing that's specific to someone who uses substances.
Yeah.
But one thing I wanted to ask you about was, you hear a lot from families where it's, well, if they just were honest or they told the truth, that's all we're asking for.
Uh-huh.
That's all we want. And part of me, the Jack Nicholson, is like, are you ready to
Right.
handle the truth?
You
Because
can't handle the truth.
I'll say to some, okay, so they come back and they come
Yep.
back over the weekend and they say, wow, they had a craving to use.
Hmm.
How do you, they're being honest with you. They're telling you what they're feeling. How do you deal with that? And it's not the greatest responses. Sometimes it's like, oh, they just want to use, or I guess they didn't care about
I
their
guess they don't
recovery.
care. Yep.
Right. Right. You hear these. So
Hmm.
one thing is, we give a lot of messages that the truth is what will set you free. This is the only thing that we want. This is only what we're asking for. But then when the truth or what someone says comes out, the families and everyone else can't always manage that well.
Hmm.
So when we look at liars, which is definitely like something attached more towards someone like you uses substances,
Hmm.
but how do you address those areas of like honesty and truth in these spaces? Because we do give these sometimes misleading messages that this is only what you got to work a honest program.
Hmm.
If you just tell the truth, we'll be okay. But then that's not always what happens.
Even in the program, like think about it, even in the rooms, right? If you're honest, sometimes you're asked to leave
Yeah.
or be quiet, right? Like we're not creating safe spaces. So going back to families, because that's who we can talk about that and maybe another day, but going back to families, because that's who I support, this is the sharing the burden of change part. Families, I'll ask them, wait a second. So is your discomfort with what they told you or, you know, do you want to hear the truth or do you want to hear what you want to hear? And usually,
Mm.
because we've developed a relationship, people will say, well, I want to hear what I want to hear. Of course you do. So do I. And how can you create safety to hear something that you might not want to hear?
Yeah, you want to
And
hear they don't want to think about drugs at all. You
yeah,
want to
I never
hear
think about
that
drugs. Yeah.
that
Yeah.
that is the furthest thing
Yeah.
from my mind. You don't
Yeah.
want to hear that the person's still having a craving or an urge or thinking about
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So part of the going back to the coat analogy, right? Like um is my need to offload this heavy coat bigger than my need to be able to hold my own coat, which is, man, I do not want to hear what they're about to tell me. And I'm going to hold space so that they can. And that's the work. That's the parallel recovery work. It's not about getting the other person to not have those thoughts or actions. It's about what you're going to do different if they do. And so, for example, you know, families hearing things that are hard to hear, my heavy coat is that is really hard for me to hear. It's okay to say that. And that's not guilt driven at all. It's just outwardly expressing an experience that I'm having. I need a second because I wasn't prepared to hear what you just told me.
Yeah.
I'm going to get a glass of water and I'm going to come back because it's important to me to actually hear what happened. Not why you did that or how you're going to fix it, but I want to hear about your experience. And if we can model, I'm having a hard time with this and I think I might need a second. Or even this, I call it a U-turn. It's another chapter, but can I take another go at that? Because what I just said isn't how I want to show up in this relationship. And I've been working on this and clearly I just stepped in the mud. I
I
want to
I,
try again.
I love the U-turn
Yeah.
chapter, and even when you use it right now, it's perfect because I get the sense that sometimes when like, it seems like you had like the one shot or the one
Yeah.
chance, and it's either a make it or break it versus we can come back to this. We can
Totally.
I feel like that happens a lot with families where it's either the moment that either this went well or this broke it, didn't go well, and we just blew this or this ruined it versus like we can come back to this stuff. We can
Totally.
we can make a
And
U-turn.
it's even beautiful to do that because if you look at the chapters and the layout of the chapters in the book, it's really structured around like how treatment is structured for somebody. Like it's very much every single chapter in that book is should be dealt with individually in treatment with people. Um, and so modeling, externally modeling, the family being able to model outwardly with their words, I that is a really hard thing for me to hear. It's causing me to have some anxiety. And that other person, the person of concern, witnessing your challenge and witnessing you working through it and witnessing you being able to continue to show up is a model to exactly what we ask them to do in so many situations. It truly is parallel recovery. It, the hopefully the family system, the people in the family system have a higher level of well-being or consciousness than the person going to treatment, and they can really start to pick some of this stuff up. So that's not always the case, but I would say most of the time it really is. And it's so powerful for the person going to treatment. If I waved my magic wand, families would go to treatment too. It just isn't, I don't know how to make that happen. It's not realistic. So there has to be another option for them, which means they've got to do external work and it should model what's going on in treatment. You
Yeah.
can't just show up at the end for the party and think that like you're going to have a different relationship.
And it's going back to, the treatment is a spot, a little
Yeah.
pause, a break, it's not a normal that it's usually it's they've never been there before. This is a new thing to them, new place. Like this isn't a part of what their life was prior
Yeah.
to, but then they go back to the same environment, to the same issues. So I do recognize that too. It's really hard to figure out how to get that for everyone. But that does lead to before we wrap up, this question I would appreciate if you could answer this from the individual who's struggling with the substances, but also the family. So part of me recognizes that it's not always easy to get families to work together. It's also hard when the families are like all adults. So when I
Yeah.
worked with kids, families were involved because they had to be, right? There's systems in place, there's guardianship, you
Yeah.
have to have them. So when I worked with kids, parents were always there. But that was a whole nother issue with kids and parents, right? So, but when you work with adults, someone's like late 20s, early 30s, and they're using substances, and then we want to try and get family involved. What I often see is because of how things have gotten, there's usually like a distance where sort of both parties are like, well, I'm trying to give them a break. They've done so much and I don't want to overburden them. Sometimes the families are, we can't take this anymore right now. We need a break from what just happened because normally something pretty substantial
Yeah.
just occurred, right? So I normally see like this separation or wanting to take a break or a pause. And then when you have someone who's 20, 30, they can choose not to have family involved, right? So for you, how do we talk to the individual who is struggling with substances as to why it's important to have family involved? But then same question is how do we talk to families
Uh-huh.
about why it's important that they get involved because it's understandable that they might want a break. They need some relief, right? Or they sometimes think, well, it's
Yep.
not my substance use, like this is theirs. So how do we talk to both sides about why it's important that they join in this parallel recovery? Because without
Yeah.
one of them, there is no parallel, right? Like then it's individual recovery, but it's not
Hmm.
the parallel that you speak so much of.
Yeah, and the opportunity is missed,
Yeah.
really, for a lot of people, and exponential growth. So, to the person in treatment, and honestly, Andrew, sometimes it's someone in their 50s or 60s, like, and like for real, and there's still a family system. So for that person, I would say there's two things. One is I really like to do work with genograms,
Mm.
which is, in short for listeners, is sort of a type of a family tree system. And I have a chapter in my book about epigenetics, and it kind of addresses that kind of stuff, right? Like talking about what are the patterns that have been, just because of the way things are passed down, been passed down to me and landed, and I'm now expressing them. And can we honor the past for why those patterns worked in the past, and then use today's moment as an opportunity to say, all right, so what's my job in shifting this for the future generations, for the relationships moving forward. I like to call it sometimes, like, if we all sit at a boardroom and we put the problem on the boardroom table, and then we all get to decide, hey, what's my part in this project, and then we see what's left over, and then maybe we share that burden too, but like everyone gets to pick their parts. So I would say to the person in treatment that your family is a part of your life, whether you want them to be or not. It's really hard to have a complete break. And by the way, you're going to have to do a whole lot more work on yourself if that's what you want, because truth be told, as much as you may not like them right now or feel bad about their experience because of you, they are a part of your energetic system. So, what would happen if we could invite them in and give them some tools to learn how to love you better, to support
Mm.
you differently? This isn't about ganging up on you with more people. This is really about inviting the whole family, who, by the way, got sick too. Their sickness just wasn't as scary as yours, to learn how to live a little bit better. That has been pretty effective, with that person. In terms of the family system, I think I would say something similar, which is, does I'm done with them mean forever? And if that's not the case, then we need to learn how to do this,
Mm.
because you or they will come back. Whether it's one day down the road, 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road. I have yet to meet a parent who can say, I'm done with them forever. That's not a thing. So, could you pause, take care of yourself, and learn how to enter this relationship more cautiously, maybe slower, with more tools, with more skills, and with more invitation to collaborate with that person? I want to help you learn how to make this better. I don't want to force you into something that is going to be abusive again for you.
And I like how you talk. You could be talking to them individually and almost still be representing the family in that, like you're trying to
Yeah.
make it where it's almost having the same conversation, representing like the family side of it, even though you might be talking to one person individually or two or three. I love that you brought up genograms. I was so fortunate to get supervision from a licensed marriage and family therapist for years, and every time we ever presented a case in supervision, it was genogram is the first thing, and using that was amazing. So I love hearing
Yeah.
that you use that. And because I think this is something where we need to get better at, you know, inviting family in and talking to the person about family. I think it's something that we realize is still a big gap in some of the treatment services and programs. And there's a lot of people like yourself who are constantly trying to encourage this and push this and even give the
Yeah.
blueprint, right? The whole
Yeah. Yeah.
blueprint of how to do it.
Yeah, I have a whole program that can be run within a treatment center that starts on day one. Like, people can drop their loved one off that day and they can start the process. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's super important because it's still a need that has not been met
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
how important it is. So I really want to appreciate that for all that it's provided and all that it does. It's a great read. I was so happy to revisit it and talk with you about it because a lot of things resonated with some of the challenges that are faced, but also the idea of parallel recovery is really unknown to a lot of people. But this is how we make it work for those with family members, loved ones, and systems.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
So, final takeaway, what
Mhm.
would you want listeners to know or to think about based on our conversation? We'll have links where they can see your TEDx talk, which I highly recommend, and to learn more about what you do, find where to get the book. But final takeaways for audience members?
Oh, there's so many. I think, let's see, if I can identify one, it would be um, if you have felt powerless in this process of watching somebody that you love struggle, your power lies in your own recovery process, which then becomes an invitation to your loved one to do better. So it's really sharing the burden of change. It starts with you. And that is, it's difficult, but it's not impossible. And there's support for you around that. Um, and it can be really empowering to both you and your loved one who's having a hard time, for them to witness you embark on this change process and realize that it's possible for them too.
Yeah, thank you. I really
Yeah,
appreciate our conversation.
thank you.
I imagine we could talk a lot more about everything that you wrote about and do with families. So really appreciate it. And thank you for coming on and talking about it. Parallel recovery, the TEDx talk, and everything that you've got going on is greatly appreciated and will definitely be important for family members and loved ones.
Thank you so much.